evening will be our fourth and final time on the gap theory. I think we'll, along with the other three messages, tonight's message will conclusively prove that such a fanciful dream and notion of man can nowhere be found in the Holy Scriptures. And people that teach such things, including men from Arkansas that call themselves teachers and charismatics, don't deserve an audience as far as I'm concerned. Back to Genesis chapter 1. By the way, next week you'll have your first quiz in here on all of this. Whatever we get through tonight, you'll be responsible for. Unless we happen to have some time left over this evening and we're going to go past the gap theory. Generally, we don't have a lot of extra time, though. So I'm planning on at least finishing up the gap theory. If we have some time, we'll go into some of the other theories, and you won't be responsible for that. Just to review the message last week that we covered, basically four things that we proved from Scripture last time that have a direct bearing upon the gap theory, its validity or the lack of it. Those four things were, first of all, the words asa and bara can be used interchangeably in Scripture. There were two arguments we were looking at, but there were actually four major things that we proved last time. First of all, asa and bara can be used interchangeably in the Scriptures. Secondly, the conjunction of Genesis 1:2 is a wall copulative disjunctive conjunction. A wall copulative disjunctive conjunction. Thirdly, Genesis 1:2a is a noun clause as opposed to a verbal clause. Fourthly and finally, it's a circumstantial clause. A noun clause, thirdly, fourthly, a circumstantial clause. All these things add up to say that verse 2 is subordinate to and explanatory of verse 1 in Genesis 1. And that's the key to the whole thing here. Verse 2 does not follow verse 1 chronologically, but it is subordinate to and explanatory of the remark that is made in verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Which means that this heaven and this earth that God created in verse 1, the same one that he goes on to talk about in verse 2. This earth was without form and void. Leaves us with two more arguments this evening. The first concerns the translation of the first verb. In Genesis 1:2, you see the verb was. The first argument concerns the translation of that. Should it be was or should it be became? The second argument we'll be looking at this evening concerns the predicate here, without form and void. The two words tohu and bohu. What is the significance of these two words? Either in your English, without form and void, or in the Hebrew, the tohu va bohu. What is the significance of those words? T-O-H-U, B-O-H-U. I think that's probably on your outline. Okay, back to verse 2 and our first argument this evening, which is our third one that we've been looking at here. If you know anything about the gap theory, you know that what they want to do with this verb in verse 2 is change it to became rather than was. Now we'll read Genesis 1 and 2 their way, and you'll see why this is significant for us to determine exactly which way this should be translated. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth became without form and void. Darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Now, if it became that way in verse 2, That means something happened to it between verses 1 and 2 to make it become this way in the final analysis. You see that? The earth became without form and void. As a matter of fact, Custance, in his book, Without Form and Void, now he's the retired Canadian physiologist turned theologian, self-appointed. He wants to put it into what we call the pluperfect, which really you can't do here, which would make that had become, and that's even stronger. Of course, he's trying to prove as much as he can in favor of the gap theory, and he wants to change it around so it says, and the earth had become without form and void, as opposed to simply saying the earth became without form and void. If you can get it into the pluperfect tense, then you've got the earth had become without form and void. Well, the Hebrew word here, and I think this is also probably on your outline, is hayatah, H-A-Y-E-T-A. It's a verb found here where we have our English word was. And the earth, hayatah, and the earth was without form and void. And it is true that this word, hayatah, can on occasion be translated became. If you study the books out on this, they all give different statistics as far as how many times this word is translated was or be and how many times it's translated become. All of them are confused on exactly how to divide up the number of times where it's found, so I'm not going to try to give you that. But we do have cases where this word is translated become. However, the verb hayatah comes from the verb haya, H-A-Y-A, which is the simple Hebrew verb to be. And we have, of course, the same verb sequence in our language. I am, you are, he, she, it is, and so forth, or you can change that to past tense. Now, the Hebrew doesn't have tenses like we do. We've got a past, a present, and a future tense. The Hebrew doesn't really have tenses. It has what you call moods or aspects, and it's either perfect or imperfect. It's either completed or not completed yet. And this verb hayatah is what we call the Qal, Q-A-L, sometimes spelled with a K, but we'll spell it with a Q, the Qal perfect third person feminine singular. The Qal perfect third person feminine singular of the verb haya, to be. It's a little difficult to explain this just in a message like this, unless you've had in high school or college or somewhere else studying other languages besides English, because of course we have things like first and second and third person, but we don't have feminine, third person feminine for a verb, or second person masculine for a verb. Of course, a word is simply a word. But in other languages like Hebrew, you've got your verbs and you've got your nouns, and they're going to either be a feminine, a masculine, or a neuter verb or noun. The reason that we've got this Qal perfect, of course, that means that it's already completed if it's Qal perfect rather than Qal imperfect. Third person feminine singular, of course, third person is either he, she, it, and here it would be she, but why are we going to have was a feminine? Why not it? Why is it she? I mean, that's the way you would read it. She was without form or void. Who's the she referring to then? The earth. What do you suppose earth is in Hebrew? A feminine word, obviously. Where do we get our terminology Mother Earth? It's because in many languages, earth happens to be a feminine word. Now, earth is a feminine word here. This is we're going to deal with this later on, and I'll show you some passages where it speaks of the earth as a she, but that doesn't have any connotation as far as Mother Earth goes, or a goddess ruling over the earth. The verb or the noun just happens to be a feminine one, and if earth is feminine, then the verb that follows it is also going to have to be in the same sex, and that's feminine, to correspond back to the word earth. Now, it's interesting that in the Septuagint, we've got this word translated, the word was, we have this verb translated with a Greek verb, and it's the Greek verb not become, it's the Greek verb to be. Now this is just a simple verb here, I guess you realize was. It's simply the past tense of the simple verb to be. I am, you are, he, she, it is. Or I was, you were, he, she, it was. We, you, and they, and so forth. Costenz and many of the other ones try to change this word to become, but you won't find any support for changing this word to become in any of your recognized Hebrew lexicons. You won't find this among any of your recognized Hebrew grammarians or linguists. They always, here in Genesis 1:2, translate the verb hayatah in its simple form, in its obvious form, and that is in the form of to be, which for us would be past tense. For the Hebrew would be the perfect mood or the perfect aspect, and that would be to translate it as was, W-A-S, rather than become. Just because, see, what they'll do is give you statistics and say, well, 4 out of 10 times hayatah is translated became over in Isaiah. But how it's translated in became in Isaiah really doesn't have anything to do with Genesis 1 and verse 2, whenever we can prove that whatever verses they're referring to in Genesis or wherever else they go has nothing to do with the creation account. And secondly, when we can prove that this verb also can equally and allowably be translated as a simple verb was, rather than to put it in what they would call the past tense or in the pluperfect. Let me just give you a comparison here to show you what I'm talking about. If you'll go over to Jonah chapter 3 and verse 3, where we have the same setup here. They are known for running to other passages. So we're going to go to another one in another place and show you how over here, just the same as in Genesis 1, we've got the same words here. Comparison of Genesis 1:2 with Jonah 3:3. And we see that Jonah 3:3 is done in the exact same way that Genesis 1:2 is. If you've got time, you can copy down whatever you can copy down. Here on the right side of the diagram, we've got Genesis 1:2. It's going to be written in the Hebrew, a transliteration, that is to put the Hebrew over into English letters, and then a translation, which is of course entirely different than a transliteration, that is to give us English words that mean or say the same thing that the Hebrew does. Then underneath that, we've got Jonah 3:3. We've got it written in the Hebrew, just like Genesis 1:2. We've got the transliteration underneath that, and finally the translation at the very bottom. In our 4 categories across the top, this is the predicate, this is the verb, this is the subject. In both cases, we happen to have the wall disjunctive in both cases. I think it's even, it's translated now. In Jonah 3:3, I told you that's probably better over there in Genesis 1:2, is now rather than and. Now this is the Hebrew, of course. Now they don't have the same sentence order that we do. But here goes what the Hebrew says there in Genesis 1. We've got a transliteration right across here, unformed and unfilled, or without form and void, was, and there's the verb that we're discussing right now. This is the whole question over this verb right here, hayatah. Unformed and unfilled was the earth and. Now watch Jonah 3:3. It's set up in almost the exact same way. A great city was, you can spot the Hebrew written there. It's exactly the same. It's the same transliteration, hayatah. A great city was Nineveh and. It's unique because it's set up in the Hebrew exactly the same as Genesis 1:2. How is hayatah translated in Jonah 3:3? Well, you can look in your Bible. Now Nineveh was an exceeding great city of 3 days' journey. Or you could say, and Nineveh was an exceeding great city of 3 days' journey. Both cases, we've got was over into the English for the Hebrew verb hayatah. No one seems to have a problem with Jonah 3:3. But they do have a problem with Genesis 1:2. If you change Genesis 1:2, then you're going to have to change Jonah 3:3. And what would that say? Now Nineveh became an exceeding great city. Well, it didn't become, it already was. And you see, that's what they're trying to do with Genesis 1:2. Now the earth became without form and void. No, it didn't become that way. It already was that way. That's the way in which we find it in Genesis 1:1 whenever God created it in the very beginning. And what's significant here in both of these cases, since we do have this wall disjunctive, we'll go look at Jonah 3 for a moment here, and then we'll come back and I'll let you finish copying that down. Look at Jonah 3:3. Remember how we told you if it's a wall disjunctive, that means it's copulative. That means that it does not follow in a sequential order. Genesis 1:1 and 2, Jonah 3:3, the same thing. So Jonah arose and went unto Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. Now we've got this wall disjunctive that's translated and over in Genesis 1:2. Here it's translated now. Now does this mean that the second part of verse 3 came after the first part of verse 3? No, it's a wall disjunctive again. That means it's subordinate to and explanatory of whatever it follows. And it's the same case here. Now Nineveh, in other words, now I'm going to tell you what Nineveh was like. The Nineveh I just mentioned in the first part of verse 3. Now Nineveh was an exceeding great city of 3 days' journey. It's the exact same setup as Genesis 1:1-2. Whenever it puts the wall disjunctive in there, then we know it's not going to translate it became, because that shows time sequence there. And if you've got a wall disjunctive, if you've got a wall copulative in there, and if you've got a noun clause, and especially if you've got a circumstantial noun clause, all three of which things we have in Genesis 1:2a, then we know it can't show any time sequence there. Therefore, it couldn't be the word become, because you'd have something happened later on, and therefore it became this in the final analysis. And you can't have that with a wall disjunctive. So regardless of where else this word might be translated became, and sometimes in other places where we don't have a wall disjunctive, then it's okay to translate it that way. But whenever you've got this wall disjunctive, as we have in both places here, we know it can't show time order, sequential development of facts and events taking place there. It has to be subordinate to and explanatory of whatever statement it follows. So Genesis 1:2 and Jonah 3:3 are a good parallel to go along with each other, not only because they use the verb hayatah, but because they have the same Hebrew sentence order. I remember Custance in his book deals with this word, this particular phase of his arguments, more than anything else. As a matter of fact, the vast majority, well over 75% of his book deals just with this one word, hayatah. Because see, the other things are too easy to explain away. Here he's got a word where it actually is translated many, many, many times in the Old Testament as became or become, either one. And naturally, since he finds something that will help him out that much, he's going to spend more time on that than he did on that wall disjunctive. Because, you could say, people, friends, they can write whatever they want to write. They can say black is white or white is black, and that doesn't mean that it is, though, just because they say that it is. And so you have to watch out what people say. They will give you statistics, and unless you really study it out on your own, and I don't know the person or haven't read his writings and know that he's trustworthy, I'm not going to trust him just because he happens to be a scholar, just because he happens to be a professor at a university, and he tells me that a certain word is translated a certain way all the time. Don't trust him unless you know him and have read some of his writings and know that he's reliable. Yes. So this is why he spends about 4/5 of his time, and he adds 13 appendices in there, all to deal with hayatah. Doesn't have much to say about Jonah 3:3, though. Okay, let's go on to the other argument, the second one that we're going to look at this evening, and that concerns the two words tohu and bohu. T-O-H-U, well, they're right here. T-O-H-U and B-O-H-U. The W-A just stuck the and in there. Tohu va bohu. In our King James Bible, these two words are rendered without form and void. Tohu is rendered without form, and bohu is rendered with the word void. Tohu without form, and bohu equals void. And what they tell us here is that these two words, when you've got them gathered together without form and void, then to them that suggests utter ruin and chaos, which only could have come about as a cataclysmic event that God brought upon the earth, namely Lucifer's flood. The word tohu is used many, many times in the Old Testament, but the word bohu only occurs 3 times, and it is always accompanied by tohu. In other words, tohu appears many times. Most of these times it appears by itself. Bohu only appears 3 times, and whenever it does appear, it always is with the word tohu, without form or formless. Isaiah 34:11. Now, in both of these other 2 places, when the 2 words are joined together, it's always in the context of divine judgment. And they add up, well, since it's that way in Isaiah and Jeremiah, it must be the same way in Genesis, and that's simply not true. It could be the same way, but we've got to let Genesis speak for itself rather than interpret Genesis 1:2 on the basis of Isaiah 34 and Jeremiah 4. But in these other 2 places where the words occur together, it occurs with the thought behind it of divine judgment. And that's what they want to get back into Genesis 1:2, is divine judgment, Lucifer's flood to destroy the world. Just to show you, we could go back up to verse 8 of Isaiah 34. Is everyone through with this now? For it is the day of the Lord's vengeance. So you see wrath, divine judgment here, and the year of recompenses for the controversy of Zion. The streams thereof shall be turned into pitch, and the dust thereof into brimstone. And the land thereof shall become burning pitch. Now this is future from Isaiah 34, point of time and reference. It shall not be quenched night nor day, the smoke thereof shall go up forever. From generation to generation it shall lie waste, none shall pass through it forever and ever. But the cormorant and the bittern shall possess it, and the owl also, and the raven shall dwell in it. And he shall stretch out upon it the line of tohu, confusion, and the stones of bohu, emptiness. This is the second place. If you want to write those words in so you'll know which is translated how. Confusion there is tohu. Emptiness is bohu. Now you saw the context here. It's strictly talking about something future from Isaiah 34. So we know there's no way that we can take verse 11 and apply it to Genesis 1:2 in any means at all. Genesis 1:2 had taken place many centuries before Isaiah 34. Then the third and final time where we see the 2 words together is, of course, over in Jeremiah 4, verse 23. Now, you'll not hear of them very often refer back to Isaiah 34, simply because you've got the 2 words confusion and emptiness there. But they always go to Jeremiah because it happens to use in English, same Hebrew word, but it happens to use in English without form and void, same words we find back in Genesis 1:2. And see, they're not thinking enough. If this applies back there, forget what the English says. The Hebrew still says tohu and bohu. If it applies back there, then so must Isaiah 34:11. See, it's a psychological trap they're falling into because they're seeing the words confusion and emptiness there in Isaiah, not realizing that the Hebrew says the same thing, and they don't really think about Isaiah 34 too much. When they come to Jeremiah 4, and it happens to use the same English words as Genesis 1:2, then they want to jump on this in a hurry and say this must apply back to the ruin and destruction of the earth in Genesis 1. I beheld the earth, and lo, it was tohu and bohu. It was without form and void. And the heavens, and they had no light. Now, we dealt with this passage before. The one critical thing to remember even if we were granting to them that there's a possibility this could refer to Genesis 1, is verse 25b, where it says, and all the birds of the heaven were fled. Just that one portion of the verse destroys their usage of Jeremiah 4 as far as basing it upon the same time event as Genesis chapter 1, because what they're saying is taking place here, and what took place in Genesis 1 is that God utterly annihilated everything, destroyed man, beast, the whole world by a flood, destroyed everything. And it would look like he must be talking about the same thing. It talks about how everything is being destroyed here, but it says, doesn't say the birds were destroyed though. It says that the birds of the heaven fled. Now see, that won't fit into your interpretation of Genesis 1 there. Because according to their interpretation, everything has to be destroyed. And here, rather than having everything destroyed, we've still got some birds flying around in heaven or outer space or somewhere. It just simply says they fled. We know they're not included. Now, from our point of view, we know other things in these verses that I pointed out to you. It couldn't be referring to the Genesis account, such as the mentioning there that all cities were broken down, where we know the first city wasn't founded or formed until over in Genesis 4. Now, that's from our point of view. From their point of view, what they say is, oh, they had cities back then. We've just never been told about them anywhere in Scripture. And these cities that he's talking about are the ones of the pre-Adamite race that have been destroyed. And you see, there's no way we could prove that that's not true. But the one thing we can have and say is verse 25b, all the birds of the heavens were fled. He didn't destroy everything, and it couldn't be referring to Lucifer's flood in Genesis 1:2. Okay, let's see. That's the three times. And then let's go over to the other scripture, of course, in Isaiah 45 and verse 18. Now, this is why this fellow has given this name to his book, Unformed and Unfilled, because that's really a better translation of these two words. In all their occasions where they occur together, these three occasions where they occur together, and also here in Isaiah 45:18, as we pointed out to you last time, it would be better to translate them unformed and unfilled. And I'll prove that to you when we go back to Genesis 1 here in a moment. But you can see that to begin with right here in verse 18. Now, tohu, I'll get the words together. Tohu here should be the one translated unformed, and bohu unfilled. Okay, Isaiah 45:18. Now pay careful attention. Thus saith the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it. He established it, he created it not in vain. Okay, what word is that? What word is that? It's void. Then what word is void? Bohu. It's bohu here. So in vain, that's just another English word they put in there. They should have gone ahead and stayed consistent with however else they've translated the word. Should have left it void like they've done in Jeremiah 4 and Genesis 1. He hath established it, he created it not void. Okay, bohu. What did I tell you bohu should be translated as? Unfilled. Now watch how that makes sense here if we'll do it unfilled rather than void. I mean, what in the world does void mean? He created it not unfilled, he formed it to be filled. Now this is the chief text they have a problem with, and they're taking a literal view of this, and they're missing the whole point of what Isaiah is saying. And he's saying God didn't create the world to stay unfilled, but he created it to fill it up. And that was the commandment he gave to Adam. That was the one he went on to repeat to Noah in Genesis 9 by saying, not replenish, but male, fill up the earth. And this is what he's saying here. He didn't create it to remain in a state of being unfilled or uninhabited, but he formed it to be inhabited, or he formed it to be filled. I am the Lord, and there is none else. Now with that in mind, let's go back to Genesis 1, verse 2. In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. Now the earth was unformed. Now you can see that without form simply means unformed. Now the earth was unformed and unfilled. And darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the water. Now I want to show you here from Genesis 1 why it would be better to go ahead and speak of the earth as being unformed and unfilled, and why we know that this is the way in which it was originally created, because chapter 1 of Genesis is divided up, after you get past verse 2, is divided up into two sections, both of these sections referring back to either or one of these two words, without form or void, or unformed, unfilled. We've got verses 3 through 10 referring back to the state of the earth being unformed. That's verses 3 through 10. And then verses 11 through 31 referring back to the state of the earth being unfilled. If they would have taken time to look at the purpose, you see, these words have a purpose for being placed in here. For God starting off in verses 1 and 2, they're really the heading of the whole chapter, verse 1 and verse 2, since it substantiates what's been said in verse 1, we know it goes along with it. Verses 1 and 2 really are the heading of what's going to take place in Genesis 1. And when he says in Genesis 1:2, now the earth, the one that he created in verse 1, was unformed and unfilled, then what's he going to go right on and show us in the rest of the chapter? Crucial why we have these two words in there. Verses 3 through 10, it's the formation of the earth there. Then verses 11 through 31, he begins to populate the earth.
For the continuing
of the earth there. Then verses 11 through 31, he begins to populate the earth. That, if you keep that in mind, then when you read Isaiah 45:18, that makes a lot of sense. God didn't create the earth to remain as it was in verse 2, unformed and unfilled. He created it. I mean, it's like having a ball of clay. If you had a round ball of clay and it was just a round ball of clay, you wouldn't say, oh, that thing must have gone through Noah's flood or Lucifer's flood or utter destruction or something. You'd say there's a piece of clay that's unformed. And if you're going to stick little men on it, you'd say, and it's also unfilled. And that's what we've got in Genesis 1:2. An earth that's unformed and unfilled. It's a large, gaseous, watery, with dust particles and so forth in it, mass. Then God's going to go on in verses 3 through 10 to begin to form the earth and its atmosphere. And then in verses 11 through 31, he's going to proceed to populate the earth, to bring denizens or inhabitants upon the earth. And therefore, he's going to fulfill what he set out to do by creating the earth in the first place without form and void, or unformed and unfilled. Now, if we didn't have those words there in Genesis 1:2, then the rest of the chapter really doesn't make as much sense. I mean, we see a whole structure. We see a train of thought, a pattern that he's setting here when he says in verse 2 that the earth at this time was without form and was empty. You'll see some versions will just translate it, it was formless and empty of all inhabitants, obviously. And that's why he's going to go on and begin to populate the earth. I don't know how many of you here even knew, perhaps before this class, that the earth in its original state was not as we know it today. Did you realize that? Most of you realize it was a big, gaseous, watery mass? You see, that's what you have to get from verses 1 and 2. And then from verses 3 through 10, when he goes on and begins to form the earth. The water, as I said there in verse 2, that doesn't refer to any flood. You don't have a mentioning of a flood anywhere else in Scripture called Lucifer's flood. That's purely a dream that some man invented. They would understand that this is the way that the earth was, the primeval earth was, whenever God initially created it. Read you a statement that Martin Luther makes in his commentary. Luther says the same thing. He says, the plain and simple meaning of what Moses says is that all things that exist were created by God, and that at the beginning of the first day there was created a shapeless lump or mass or earth with fog and water. Now, if you study some of your theologians, they know that this was the state of the earth in the very beginning. It's not something that we are dreaming up. It says right there that it was unformed and unfilled. Later, during the remaining time of the first day, God put into it light so that the light of day was shining and the shapeless heaven and earth could be seen, still without any shape to it, because he's going to go on and do that later on. This was not unlike a shapeless, crude seed from which things can be generated and produced. Starting there with the original ball, and then he's going to begin to form it. Now, I think the reason why, I know why, friends, I know the reason why so many people have fallen for this in some of your charismatic circles is because you know as well as I do, most of them have come out of the denominational system, and I think most of you would agree you didn't know the earth was like that in the beginning. I was never taught that in my denomination. I just assumed in reading over Genesis 1 that when God made the earth, he just made the earth like I see it out there. And I never took time to read the first two verses to see that there was a primeval earth before God began to form it that was quite a bit different from the earth on which we live today. And you see, because these people have come out of that same type of background, they've never been taught Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2. And you see, if they'd been taught those two verses, they'd know that the earth, when it was first created by God, was not as it was at the end of the creation week after he had done some forming on the earth. And I believe if they would, I know if they would realize that, well, obviously, if you realize that, there's no way you'd ever believe in a gap theory, because there's no need for destruction of the earth. There's no need then for an explanation of the water found in verse 2. You've already got your explanation. Because you see, he goes on in verses 9 and 10 to begin to divide that water. That's how we know that the whole earth's surface was covered, submerged in water to begin with. And he's going to go on in verses 9 and 10 and take about, or at least of what we have today, it wasn't then, but 29% of the surface and make it dry land and leave 71% for water. That's what we have, of course, today. It's remarkable that all of we human beings, all 4.5 billion of us, live on 29% of the earth's surface. And when you've got all that remainder, the over 70%, almost 3/4 of the earth's surface is submerged in water. Of course, you can't live on that. Well, that's the two arguments. You got any questions on those? We've got some time to go on to, we're not through with the gap theory, but we're going to look at several other things. Yes, brother. It'll be on everything up through the gap theory. Yeah. If we happen to go past the gap theory tonight, which I don't think we will, won't cover that. But everything from the very beginning up through what we're finishing up tonight on the gap theory. Anything else? Yes. Bohu is only used 3 times. Genesis 1:2, Isaiah 34:11, and Jeremiah 4:23. And every time bohu is used, tohu is always used along with it. But the reverse of that is not true. Tohu is used many times by itself without bohu. Now just Is that what you're asking about? Well, maybe I said something wrong. Let me go back to it and look and see. Well, I must have made a mistake. That would be tohu then. Well, what did I say that Isaiah... Yeah, that's right. I'll check that and tell you that later on. So obviously now you're not going to be held responsible for something like that. Okay, anything else then?
The chart again? Okay. I'll look that up. I might have miscounted the times where that appeared. I'll have to look that back up again. If you want a good lexicon, I just mentioned that. For Hebrew words, of course, everyone uses this, even if they're going to use it to their own destruction for proving something that doesn't really exist, is Brown, Driver, and Briggs Hebrew lexicon, if you want to get one yourself. Not guaranteeing you that you'll understand everything that's said in there, really know how to read it, but Brown, Driver, and Briggs. Sounds like a law firm, but it's three men together writing a lexicon, a Hebrew lexicon. Brown, Driver, Briggs. B-R-I-G-G-S, I believe. Driver. Brown, Driver, Briggs. BDB. It's a word where it's a book where you look up Hebrew words or whatever language you're talking about. A good Greek lexicon is Art and Gingrich lexicon. A-R-N-D-T, Art and Gingrich. G-I-N-G-R-I-C-H. G-I-N-G-R-I-C-H. Art and Gingrich. That's a Greek lexicon. So those are two, Old Testament and New Testament, either one. Okay, I want to just go over several statements here on from off the tape to see if, just to mention some things, some quotes that I wrote down off the tape on the world that was. Some of them we hadn't gotten to cover because they're not really an official part of the gap theory and what others have to say about the gap theory. First of all, he says Noah's flood, of course, was the second one to hit the earth. The first one was found in Genesis 1:2. That's just an interpretation. You'll never find a verse that says that. He says on the tape that some type of man, and he calls him a man, existed 5 billion years ago. And then he says you cannot prove this wrong from the Bible. And I'm going to show you in a moment we can prove that to be wrong. Hebrews 2:5. Hebrews 2:5. Here he tells us that the first earth, by implication, was ruled by angels. From Hebrews 2:5, that's the wrong implication. He reads the verse, "For unto the angels hath he not put in subjection the world to come, whereof we speak." And he makes the comment, that's a strange verse sitting there. Of course he hasn't put the world to come in subjection to angels. Why would we think that he had, or that he was going to put the world into subjection to angels, unless he had put some world in the past in subjection to them? But that's not what he's talking about in Hebrews 2. What he's talking about in Hebrews 2 is the superiority of angels over men while they're on this earth, and then men over angels in the next life. It's not a contrast between a pre-Adamite world and the world to come. It's a contrast over the rank of the angels as compared to men upon this earth and in the future world. Now see, you never would have gotten that from just reading Hebrews 2:5, that at time past angels must have controlled some world, because they never did. He makes another statement. He says if we could teach the world what the Bible says about creation, then science would accept it because it fits right in with what they have already found out. That's wrong. The Bible says time and time again, is never going to accept. The world's never going to accept what Christianity stands for, and if it ever does, then your Christianity's wrong. He says the Eden of Ezekiel 28:13 is not Adam's Eden, but it was the garden on the first earth, and this is where Lucifer ruled. That's not true either. That's the spiritual heavenly Eden there, because it goes on to say in the same passage in Ezekiel 28 that Lucifer was the covering cherub that covered the very throne of God, And if we put Lucifer down here on some earth in his garden Eden, that means we've got to put God down here in Eden too. If he's the cherub that covers God's throne, that means God's down here in Eden. And we know that's not true. Man is up on earth, God in heaven, therefore let thy words be few. That's, I think, in Ecclesiastes 5. We're told God doesn't live on the earth, God lives in heaven. So that would be a false interpretation. He says that the earth as we now know it is only 6,000 years old. And that's wrong. The earth as we know it's older than that. Then in Psalm 104, one of you brought this passage up earlier. Psalm 104, if you'll turn over there, verses 5 through 7. He tries to show us how this flood, and it is talking about a flood here, all right. This flood must be talking about Lucifer's flood, because the water leaves the earth in an instant of time after God rebukes the water. And we know the water in Noah's flood remained on the earth for many, many days. So here he thinks he's got a verse for Lucifer's flood. Who laid the foundations of the earth, that it should not be removed forever. Psalm 104:6, thou coverest it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At thy rebuke they fled. At the voice of thy thunder they hasted away. Now, he says that doesn't really read like Noah's flood, because Noah's flood, it says that the water was going and returning back and forth. And it took a period of time. Well, we can say two things about that. First of all, he's forgetting that Psalm 104 and all of Psalms is poetical writing. And you can't interpret everything literally. A lot of times in the Psalms, you know, it talks about God breathing fire out of his nostrils. You think he's ever done that? Why, who are you kidding? Who is he kidding? I'm not going to let him kid me. Besides that, let's just read the next two verses, and it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt this is Noah's flood that he's talking about. They go up by the mountains, they go down by the valleys. This is speaking of the water here, into the place which thou hast founded for them. And what are we going to do with verse 9? Thou hast set a bound that they may not pass over, that they turn not again to cover the earth. Now, if this is Lucifer's flood, Noah's flood did it all over again. That would contradict verse 9 directly. You see, what a fool, friend. And I'm not calling him a fool. He's making himself out to be a fool. So read verses 5, 6, and 7, and never read verse 9. In the same passage, proves that this is Noah's flood that he's referring to. It couldn't be Lucifer's flood. Besides that, I'm always amused at people whenever they call a singular psalm in the plural. I watch for people that say, turn to Psalms 104. They don't know what they're talking about right away. The same people always call Revelation in the plural, Revelations 4. And where they got that, I don't know. A devil must have told them that. But it's a singular psalm, Psalm 104. You watch some people. You heard some people call it Psalms 104 and Revelations 4. I don't know where they got that. 2 Peter 2, verse 4. Oh, I don't know where he really went wrong in 2 Peter 2. Seems like the passage here even mentions Noah's flood. He says 2 Peter 2:4 is talking about the angels ruling on the earth. On the contrary, there's a contrast between not heaven and earth, but heaven and hell here. God spared not the angels that sinned. Well, where were they when they were sinning? They were in heaven. But cast them down to the earth? No, to hell, Tartaros, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. Now, I don't know where you're going to get anywhere in that verse if this is talking about the angels that ruled on the earth. It skips over the earth. If anything, it talks about heaven and hell, and skips over the middle part, earth here. He says verse 5 is talking about Lucifer's flood, where it says, and God spared not the old world. But look right what the verse goes on to say. But he saved Noah. Must be talking about Noah's flood here. And he says that verse 5a is talking about 2 Peter 2:5a, Lucifer's flood. And the verse itself contains Noah's name. We know he's talking about Noah's flood. Of course, it's the same flood, Noah's flood, spoken of in chapter 3. Peter has spoken twice about Noah, once in his first epistle, then for the second time in 2 Peter 2, his name is mentioned. And so on that basis, we know he's still talking about the same flood in 2 Peter chapter 3 when he gets there. Then, one final thing, I'd never heard this from anyone until I heard him say it. All you need is the second word there on the list. Katabole is a Greek word that we have translated foundation in our English version. And he made a big deal about that this word in the Greek means a casting down. That's exactly what it means, a casting down. Well, what do you do to a foundation? You throw it up? No, you throw it down, right into the ground. Symbolical usage. Let's see, he gave several verses. Matthew 13:35 is one. We see this word used in two different senses here. Sometimes it talks about from the foundation of the world, and in other places it talks about before the foundation of the world. These places I'm giving here, first of all, are from the foundation of the world. And since that word, the word actually means a casting down, and we have our derivative word foundation from it because you cast the foundation down and then you build a house upon top of it, he says that where it says foundation of the world, you should leave it casting down of the world, and that means the destruction of the world that God brought upon it by Lucifer's flood. That it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, saying, I will open my mouth in parables, and I will utter things which have been kept secret from the casting down or from the destruction of the world. But how it's written, you should leave it just like that, before the foundation of the world. That is, before God's creation of the world. Then another verse in Revelation 13:8 that talks about from the foundation of the world. And three verses that refer to before the foundation of the world. First of all, over in John 17. John 17:24. He says, Father, thou lovest me before the foundation of the world. And he says this should be before the destruction of the world. Now, that doesn't make any sense. You've got a big time gap, according to them, between God's creation of the world and his destruction of the world. And if we read this destruction of the world, and Jesus says, Father, you love me before the destruction of the world, but what about before the creation of the world? Maybe he didn't love him then. I mean, we've got a watershed here. You've got before the foundation of the world, and you've got after the foundation of the world. And according to them, you'd have an after the destruction of the world, a before the destruction of the world, and then a before the creation of the world in the very beginning. What were the other scriptures? Ephesians 1:4, 1 Peter 2:20. We're not going to turn to those. Ephesians 1:4, 1 Peter 1:20. Okay, let's close up with some final thoughts on the gap theory. We'll be through tonight. We'll be through with the gap theory, and we better stop after that. If people don't read Hebrew or don't believe what we said about Hebrew, then we've got some final thoughts that are rather conclusive, and some final scriptures that we've not even looked at yet that are rather conclusive against the gap theory. First of all, if the gap theory is true, then we've got several billion years of earth history of which God has told us nothing about. That's illogical. That's about the same as people who believe there's life on other planets. That's just illogical to believe that. If there were life on other planets, then he would have told us so. And if we had these several billions of years of Earth history, then he would have told us something about them. Secondly, this gap that we have here in the gap theory is allegedly when all the fossils were deposited. But how is it that we have animals and plants today that are identical to the fossils back then, and we've got nothing to bridge the gap between the two? You see, in Noah's flood, we've got some animals and some plants that'll bridge the gap. We've got animals before Noah's flood or that died in Noah's flood. He carried some along with him. That's how we can have some of the same types of animals today. But if we've got a total destruction of the world, this is when all the fossils took place, we've got no animals or no plants carried over to the new world that he was going to form, then how can we have plants and animals that are identical to the fossils that allegedly were deposited during this gap period? And if they say, well, God simply, whenever he recreated things, and he recreated the animals just like before he destroyed them, then why is it he only recreated some of the animals the same, but he didn't recreate any dinosaurs? And of course, what they tell us is the dinosaurs lived back during this gap period, and no dinosaurs lived after Genesis 1:3. Thirdly, the Bible only speaks of two universal judgments upon this planet in 2 Peter 3. Very explicit. It only speaks of two universal judgments. One was by water. That was Noah's flood. And what will the second one be by? By fire. And he talks about the first world and then the second one. Never mentions the third one there. That's in 2 Peter 3. Fourthly, the gap theorists contend, as he did on the tape, that there existed prior to Genesis 1 a whole pre-Adamite, pre-Adamic race of men. Turn over to 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 45. They tell us that a whole race of men existed before Adam, in other words. What does 1 Corinthians 15:45 say? And so it is written, the first man, Adam, was made a living soul. The last Adam was made a quickening spirit. Who was the first man? Adam was the first man. There were no men before Adam. The Bible calls him the first man. Now, if we've got a race of men before that, it'd have to call him the 100 millionth or billionth man. And they'll say, well, it says there, that that Adam was the first man and Jesus was the last man, and really we know that there are a lot of men after Jesus. What's interesting, it never calls Jesus the last man. It only calls him the last Adam. It calls the first one the first Adam, and it calls Jesus the last Adam. We got the first Adam and the last Adam, but then it calls that first Adam something else. Man. Anthropos. It says the first anthropos, Adam. It calls him the first man. So you've got a scriptural verse proof against any men existing before Adam. Along with Genesis 3:20, Eve is called the mother of all living. Then fifthly, they tell us that there was sin and consequently death and destruction in the world before Adam. The Bible contradicts this in Romans 5:12. Sin entered the world by one man. It didn't say sin entered the world by Lucifer. It says sin entered the world by Adam, and death came by Adam. That means we can have no death and no sin in the world prior to Adam. Romans 5:12. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for all have sinned. It would have to say, for by one fallen angel sin entered into the world, and then death and destruction, the death of the dinosaurs, the depositing of the fossils, and so forth. We know that whatever was deposited as far as fossils are concerned had to have come after the time of Adam. And my favorite verse on this whole thing, and the one that proves it beyond a shadow of a doubt, is found in the next to last chapter of the Bible in the first verse. Revelation 21 and verse 1. You want to know how many earths and worlds there have been. And he clearly says on the tape, there was an old world, then there's the world that we live on now, and there's going to be a future world. Revelation 21:1, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. It calls this earth on which we live the first earth. Now, if there had really been an earth that had been totally annihilated by a flood, you see, Noah's flood covered everything. There were a lot of things that survived Noah's flood, as we'll show you later on. It was not nearly as devastating as what Lucifer's flood was and would have been, if it's true, according to what they say. Lucifer's flood annihilated everything. That destroyed the first earth, the first world. God had to recreate a new one. That would make this one on which we live the second earth. But the Bible clearly says there's only going to be two, the one on which we now live and the one that's going to come in the future. A contrast between the first earth and the second earth. We'd have to have a third one if there was such a thing as Lucifer's flood in the gap there. So all you need is Revelation 21 and verse 1 if a person's honest and open-minded and wants to believe what the Bible says. It would have to say here, I saw a new heaven, a new earth, for the second heaven and the second earth were passed away. Okay, we're going to stop right there. We're not going to have time to go into some of the other theories.